Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving deep into the rise and fall of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. You guys sent in some truly incredible source material for this one. And let me tell you, it's both fascinating and incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, it's really one of those stories that just sticks with you.
It really is. We're going to be uncovering some surprising facts, and I think try to wrap our heads around how this regime, I mean, they had this vision of a communist utopia, but ended up causing the death of nearly 25% of the Cambodian population. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's a truly tragic example of how ideology, it can be twisted. It can be twisted to justify like unimaginable brutality.
Exactly. And one of the things that I found most striking as I was going through this material was the contrast between Pol Pot's seemingly like normal upbringing and the path he ultimately chose. I mean,
It's really quite a disconnect when you look at it.
it is. And we're going to kind of trace that journey from his childhood, his exposure to Marxist ideology in France, his rise to power within the Khmer Rouge,
Right.
and then, of course, the horrific policies that were enacted during his reign.
Yeah.
Yeah, buckle up, folks, because this is a wild ride through history.
It definitely is. And I think, one of the most fascinating aspects of this story is the fact that Pol Pot actually received advice, guidance, you could say, from Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung. I mean, even these guys, notorious dictators, known for their own, ruthlessness.
Yeah. I mean, these are not exactly, shrinking violets when it comes
Not at all, no.
to brutality and repression. But even they seem to kind of caution against his extreme measures, which is just,
It's almost unbelievable when you think about it.
it is. It really makes you wonder, if they were the ones saying, yeah, maybe you should tone it down a bit, just how extreme were his plans. And to kind of understand this, we need to go back to the beginning, right? And you might be surprised to learn this, but Pol Pot, his birth name was Saloth Sar, born in 1925. He actually had a relatively privileged childhood.
Yeah, he did. I mean, it's not what you would necessarily expect. His family was prosperous. They had connections to the Cambodian royal family, and he even had the opportunity to study abroad in France.
That's not exactly the breeding ground you would imagine for a revolutionary leader.
No, not at all.
It's almost like one of those, sliding doors moments in history. What if he had never gone to France? Would Cambodia's fate have been different?
It's a question we can't answer, of course, but it's fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
But his time in France, the late 1940s, that was definitely a pivotal period for him. That's when he was exposed to Marxist and communist ideologies. And you can see how that really shaped his worldview going forward.
Right. So he comes back to Cambodia in 1953. And at this time, the country is in the midst of the First Indochina War. They're fighting for their independence from France. And, Pol Pot, he joins the Kampuchean, or Cambodian Communist Movement. This is what would later evolve into the Khmer Rouge. And it seems kind of natural given the context of what was happening in the country.
Yeah, it makes sense on the surface, right? But it's interesting because the Khmer Rouge, they actually tried to gain power through peaceful means initially. They even participated in elections in 1955.
Oh, I didn't realize that. So they were trying to work within the system.
They were.
But I'm guessing it didn't go so well.
No, it was a crushing defeat.
Ah, so that probably pushed them towards a more radical approach.
Exactly. And ironically, it was the king's crackdown on suspected communist sympathizers that actually fueled the Khmer Rouge's growth. By pushing them underground, they essentially, drove them into the arms of more extreme elements within the movement.
Right. It's like they created their own worst enemy.
Yeah, you could say that.
So picture this, right? The Khmer Rouge are retreating into these jungles. It's this isolated, kind of pressure cooker environment. And that's where Pol Pot starts to emerge as this key figure. He's consolidating power, meticulously planning for this revolution that he's envisioned.
Right. And then, in 1965, a pivotal event happens. Pol Pot travels to China. And this wasn't just, a casual visit. This was a big deal. He was hosted by Deng Xiaoping himself and received training from Chinese officials.
Wait a minute, hold on. So the future leader of the Khmer Rouge, who we know is going to be responsible for this brutal regime, is being mentored by leading figures of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yep.
What were they teaching him?
They were giving him insights into, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the intricacies of class struggle, and even the mechanics of political purges. But perhaps even more impactful than any classroom setting was the fact that Pol Pot witnessed the Cultural Revolution firsthand.
Wow. Okay. So this is something I think a lot of people might not know, this direct link between the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the Khmer Rouge.
Right.
It's almost like he's getting this like master class in how to reshape society through radical ideology.
Exactly. This was a formative experience for him. Think about it. The Cultural Revolution, with its emphasis on purging quote-unquote impure elements and this intense veneration of Mao, it provided, in a sense, this blueprint for the horrors that he would unleash in Cambodia.
Wow. Okay, so this trip to China really kind of connects the dots. It shows how ideologies can be adapted, distorted to fit different contexts. But even with this, I mean, he's still a long way from seizing power in Cambodia at this point, right?
Yeah, he is. But fast forward a few years to 1975, and the Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot's leadership, they achieve this stunning victory. They seize control of Cambodia. They capture the capital, Phnom Penh.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's really where we see the Khmer Rouge's utopian vision kind of collide with the brutal reality of their regime, right? I mean, one of the first things they do is they order the evacuation of Phnom Penh. Over 2.5 million people. I mean, imagine that. Over 2.5 million people driven from their homes under this pretense of an impending U.S. bombing.
It was a complete upheaval of urban life.
It was. And the sources we have, I mean, they paint this horrifying picture. Sick people forced from hospitals, families torn apart, everyone herded into the countryside. I mean, it was just chaos and terror on a scale that's hard to even comprehend.
And this was all part of Pol Pot's plan. He envisioned transforming Cambodia into this agrarian utopia, right?
Yeah.
To do that, he had to dismantle capitalism. He had to purge any remaining support for Sihanouk, who had been deposed. He had to eliminate, suspected CIA networks. I mean, this forced evacuation, it was really this brutal way to consolidate power and force the urban population into agricultural labor.
Wow. It's incredibly jarring to think about, this vision of a pure agrarian society achieved through such a brutal means. It really makes you wonder, what was life actually like under the Khmer Rouge?
Yeah, it was essentially, it was an erasure of individual rights and freedom. Money was abolished. Cambodia was turned into essentially a slave state where people were forced to work unpaid under threat of punishment. I mean, it's
hard to even grasp what that must have been like, to have your entire way of life, your freedom, even your own identity, like stripped away.
Yeah.
Was there anything, any part of Cambodian life that wasn't under the control of the regime?
I mean, virtually every aspect of life was scrutinized and manipulated to fit the Khmer Rouge ideology. Even language was modified. Like they were encouraged to use we instead of I to promote, that socialist collectivism idea.
It's just amazing to me how they tried to control even the way people thought. Like right down to the words they use.
Yeah, exactly. Language was seen as this tool to reshape thinking, to reshape people. And it didn't stop there. I mean, sports were banned. Reading material was restricted to government propaganda. Any form of individual expression, whether it was clothing, religious practices, it was ruthlessly suppressed.
And then there were the killings, right? And from what I've read, this wasn't just like random violence. This was calculated. This was systematic.
It was. Anyone deemed a bad element was at risk of execution. And the criteria for being labeled a bad element, I mean, it was incredibly broad. It could be anything. It could be being educated. It could be wearing glasses. It was...
So essentially anyone who didn't fit into this very narrow vision of a pure agrarian society was a target.
Precisely. Pol Pot's logic, as twisted as it was that eliminating these individuals, it was necessary. It was necessary to purify the populace to achieve this utopian dream. And it's just a chilling example of how ideology, when it's taken to the extreme, can dehumanize entire groups of people.
Yeah. And certain groups were particularly vulnerable, right? Like intellectuals, professionals. I mean, they were seen as a threat to the regime.
Absolutely. Intellectuals and professionals, they were systematically targeted. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, anyone who could, read or write well, anyone who represented like the intellectual elite of Cambodia, they were deemed enemies of the revolution. They were executed. They were sent to forced labor camps, or they just disappeared.
It's almost like they were trying to erase Cambodia's intellectual history, to engineer a society where independent thought was impossible.
In a way, they were. They saw knowledge and critical thinking as threats to their absolute control.
It's terrifying to think about. And to add another layer of complexity to all of this, Pol Pot was actually receiving advice from some pretty unlikely sources during this time. Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, even these guys, notorious dictators, known for their own ruthlessness.
Right.
They seemed to caution him against against going too far. It's
Yeah.
almost unbelievable.
It is. I mean, Mao, who unleashed the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, he supposedly advised Pol Pot to avoid extreme measures, to not blindly imitate China's socialist model, and Kim Il-sung also seemed to suggest a more measured approach.
So what do you make of that? Do you think they genuinely believed that Pol Pot was taking things too far, or were they just trying to kind of protect their own interests?
It's a great question. It's hard to know for sure, but perhaps they saw the potential for instability. Maybe they were trying to distance themselves. Whatever their motivations, ultimately their advice, it fell on deaf ears.
Yeah. And that leads us to, I guess, the beginning of the end for the Khmer Rouge,
Yeah.
the Vietnamese invasion. Up until this point, Pol Pot's grip on Cambodia seemed absolute. But there were tensions brewing with Vietnam, who, vehemently opposed his regime, the way he was treating the Cambodian people.
Right. And in December of 1978, Vietnam, they took decisive action. They launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. Within 2 weeks, they had captured Phnom Penh, and they established a pro-Vietnamese government.
It must have been just this huge shift for the Cambodian people. I mean, did they see the Vietnamese as liberators?
For many, yes, it was a glimmer of hope in the midst of this really dark period, a chance for something new. But for Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, it was a crushing defeat.
So what happened to Pol Pot after all of this? Did he just disappear?
Not exactly. He lived for another 2 decades, although in, declining health and facing these internal struggles within the Khmer Rouge. He fled to Thailand. He continued to exert some influence, but his power was definitely waning.
It's hard to imagine, him living with the weight of his actions, knowing what he had caused.
It is. And in a strange twist, he actually granted an interview to an American journalist, Nate Thayer, back in 1997. And in that interview, he claimed his conscience was clear, but admitted that mistakes had been made.
That's just a chilling glimpse, into the mind of someone who orchestrated such horrific atrocities. To claim a clear conscience after all that, it's just incomprehensible.
It really is. And it speaks to, I think, the power of self-deception, the ability to rationalize even the most brutal actions. And just a year later, in 1998, Pol Pot, he died. The circumstances are a bit mysterious, potentially suicide or a heart attack. And his death, it marked the end of this incredibly dark chapter in Cambodian history. But the scars of his regime, they continue to haunt the country to this day.
It's just a stark reminder that, even in the modern world, utopian ideologies, they can have these devastating consequences. And the pursuit of power can corrupt even the most, well-intentioned individuals. I mean, Pol Pot's regime wasn't just a historical anomaly. It really offers these important lessons about human nature, I think, about the fragility of civilization itself.
It does. And it's so easy to look back, and say, oh, that could never happen here. But history has this way of repeating itself if we're not careful. And I think one of the things that strikes me about Pol Pot is that he wasn't this, sadistic tyrant reveling in cruelty. He genuinely believed that he was building a better world. However, misguided and twisted that vision may have been.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes these totalitarian regimes so dangerous, right? It's that fanaticism, that unshakable belief that their cause is just, and that any means are justified to achieve their goals.
Exactly. And Pol Pot's regime is just this stark reminder that good intentions without careful consideration for the consequences that can lead to just unimaginable horror. I mean, his vision of this agrarian utopia, it required this complete dismantling of existing social structures, the eradication of individual rights, and the suppression of any form of dissent.
And he wasn't operating in a vacuum. I mean, he was drawing inspiration from other revolutionary movements, particularly, the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
Right.
He saw it as this model for achieving rapid social change, even if it meant, resorting to violence and terror.
Yeah. He adapted those tactics to the Cambodian context, creating this system of control and surveillance that permeated every aspect of life. I mean, children were separated from their parents and indoctrinated into this Khmer Rouge worldview, traditional Cambodian culture, religion. It was systematically destroyed.
It's just hard to grasp the level of control they exerted over people's lives. They manipulated everything, family structures, language. I mean, it was a totalitarian state in the truest sense.
And that control, it was maintained through this atmosphere of just pervasive fear. People lived in constant terror of being denounced, accused of disloyalty, of ending up in one of the regime's, infamous killing fields.
Yeah. Yeah. The psychological impact of living under that kind of constant threat, I mean, it was to have been immense. To never know who to trust, to never feel safe.
Right. And it's so important to remember that, the victims of the Khmer Rouge, they weren't just statistics. These were real people, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents. They had their lives brutally cut short by this regime that saw them as expendable in the pursuit of this utopian fantasy.
It's heartbreaking to think about, the individual stories, the families that were torn apart, the dreams that were shattered, the potential that was lost.
Hmm.
And all of that for an ideology that ultimately led to nothing but death and destruction.
It's a tragedy on a monumental scale. And one of the things that I think continues to fascinate me about the Khmer Rouge is this targeted persecution of intellectuals. It's almost like they saw knowledge itself as a threat.
Yeah, that's something that we see throughout history, isn't it? Dictators and authoritarian regimes, they often view, educated individuals, those who can think critically and challenge the status quo, as their biggest enemies.
Exactly. And for the Khmer Rouge, this fear was particularly acute. Anyone with an education, anyone who could read or write well, anyone who spoke multiple languages, they were all seen as potential threats to their revolution.
Yeah, it was almost like an attempt to erase Cambodia's intellectual
Oh.
history, to to engineer this society where independent thought was impossible.
Like they were trying to create this blank slate, upon which they could inscribe their own twisted vision of the world.
And their vision of this agrarian utopia, it has to be viewed, I think, within the context of Cambodia's history. This wasn't just some random ideology that they pulled out of thin air.
Right. It was deeply rooted in Cambodia's past, in its long tradition of, rice farming, rural life. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why it appealed to some segments of the population, particularly those who had been, marginalized or dispossessed under previous regimes. They saw in the Khmer Rouge's vision this promise of a return to a simpler, purer way of life.
Yeah. So in a way, they were tapping into these pre-existing cultural narratives, even if they ultimately twisted those narratives to serve their own ends.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand that historical and cultural context because it helps to explain how an ideology as extreme as the Khmer Rouge's, how it was able to gain traction.
Yeah. And I think the regime's attempts to kind of rewrite history are also fascinating. It's like they didn't just want to change the present; they wanted to control the past as well.
Right. They were masters of manipulating information, shaping public perception. They abolished money. They rewrote calendars. They destroyed historical monuments. They even banned traditional Cambodian clothing.
It was just this radical attempt to reshape not just Cambodian society, but the very fabric of Cambodian identity.
And that control over information, that manipulation of history, it was essential to their grip on power
Yeah.
because they understood that if people don't have access to accurate information, if they can't remember the past, they can't effectively challenge the present. It's a chilling reminder of how important it is to preserve historical memory, to protect freedom of speech and the press, and to ensure that, multiple perspectives and narratives are represented in our understanding of the past.
Yeah. It's a lesson that we can never afford to forget.
Absolutely. And one aspect of the Khmer Rouge regime that I think is particularly hard to grapple with is the sheer scale of the human suffering that they inflicted. It's estimated that 2 million people died, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population at the time.
It's a staggering number,
Mm.
and it represents this catastrophic loss of human life. It's a gaping wound in the soul of a nation.
And it wasn't just the raw numbers. It was the manner in which these people died.
Yeah.
Executions, starvation, disease, overwork. The Khmer Rouge's killing fields, where hundreds of thousands of victims were brutally murdered and buried in mass graves. I mean, they're just these chilling testaments to the regime's barbarity.
Yeah. And their policies of forced labor and relocation led to widespread famine and disease. People were worked to death, starved to death, or just left to die from treatable illnesses.
The trauma that was inflicted by the Khmer Rouge, it runs deep. And its legacy, it continues to affect Cambodian society today.
It's hard to fathom the level of suffering that the Cambodian people endured during those dark years.
Mhm.
Entire families wiped out, villages emptied, communities just shattered.
It's a reminder that utopian ideologies, they can have these devastating human consequences, and that the wounds of history, they can take generations to heal.
Yeah. And I think another layer of complexity to all of this is the role of foreign powers in this tragedy. Cambodia wasn't just this isolated case of a regime gone rogue. It was deeply entangled in the geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War.
Right. I mean, the United States, for example, was heavily involved in Cambodia during the Vietnam War, conducting bombing campaigns, supporting the Lon Nol regime, which had overthrown Prince Sihanouk in 1970.
And those actions, however well-intentioned they may have been at the time, they inadvertently, created the conditions for the Khmer Rouge's rise to power.
Exactly. The bombing campaigns, they destabilized the country. They drove people into the arms of the Khmer Rouge, fueled this anti-American sentiment. And the Lon Nol regime, which was seen as corrupt and incompetent, it just further alienated huge segments of the population.
It's this complex and tragic irony, right? The U.S., through its actions in Vietnam and Cambodia, helped to create the very monster that it would later condemn.
It is. And it wasn't just the U.S. China, under Mao Zedong, also provided significant support to the Khmer Rouge, both, ideologically and materially.
Yeah, they saw the Khmer Rouge as this potential ally in their regional rivalry with the Soviet Union and Vietnam.
Right. And they provided them with weapons, training, and political guidance, which helped to shape the regime's radical ideology and brutal tactics.
It's just a sobering reminder that even the most horrific regimes, they rarely operate in isolation. They often rely on the support of other states, either directly or indirectly.
And it's essential to recognize that those who support or enable such regimes, even if they don't, directly participate in the atrocities, they bear some responsibility for the suffering that ensues.
Absolutely. And speaking of influencing people and controlling narratives, propaganda also played a significant role in the Khmer Rouge's, rise and rule.
Absolutely. Propaganda was essential to this regime, both in gaining power and then maintaining control once they were in charge. They used it to demonize their enemies, glorify their leaders, instill fear in the population, and create this cult-like atmosphere around Pol Pot. I mean, they controlled all forms of media, newspapers, radio broadcasts, posters, public gatherings. They rewrote textbooks. They forced people to attend indoctrination sessions. It was all about shaping the way people thought and what they believed.
And it sounds like it was incredibly effective.
It was. It played on, pre-existing social divisions. It tapped into nationalist sentiment. It exploited people's fears and anxieties. It helped to create this climate of suspicion and paranoia where people were afraid to trust anyone, even their own families. It's a stark reminder that propaganda can be a powerful weapon, especially when it's used by those in power, or those who control the flow of information.
Yeah, it highlights the importance of critical thinking, media literacy, being able to discern fact from fiction, especially in our current age, right?
Sure.
I mean, we're just inundated with information all the time.
Exactly. We need to be able to evaluate the information we're consuming and not just, blindly accept what we're told.
Right. I think it's also worth exploring, how the Khmer Rouge maintained their grip on power for as long as they did. I mean, the regime was so clearly opposed to the interest of the vast majority of the population. How did they survive for nearly 4 years?
Yeah, it's a question that's puzzled historians and political scientists for decades, and there's no single answer, of course. But I think a key element was just their ruthlessness in silencing dissent and eliminating potential threats. They created this climate of fear that was so pervasive that people were just afraid to speak out, even to think critically.
Right. And that fear was compounded by their control over information, their manipulation of history. They went to these extraordinary lengths
Yeah.
to create this new reality, their own version of truth.
And to some extent, they were successful. Many Cambodians, particularly those who were, young or who had been indoctrinated in the regime's ideology, they genuinely believed in the Khmer Rouge's vision. And that's one of the most, I think, dangerous aspects of totalitarian regimes. It's that ability to create their own reality and use it to control people's minds and actions. It's a chilling reminder of the importance of, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to access information.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember that, Cambodia has this long and complex history.
Mm.
The Khmer Rouge regime, it wasn't just an isolated event.
Right. This wasn't a country that was unfamiliar with violence or upheaval. Cambodia has a long history of conflict. But the Khmer Rouge's, reign of terror, this was something different. It was something unprecedented in its scale and its brutality.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how a nation with such a rich cultural heritage, such a deep sense of history, could succumb to such a brutal and destructive ideology?
It's a complex question, but I think part of it has to do with the specific circumstances of the time, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the political instability that had been plaguing Cambodia in the years leading up to the Khmer Rouge takeover. Those factors definitely played a role. But I think it's also important to consider, the allure of their ideology, their vision of an agrarian utopia. It offered a sense of purpose and belonging to a population that had been traumatized by war and political turmoil. They promised this radical change, a clean break from the past, a new and egalitarian society.
And that message, it clearly resonated with some Cambodians, even if it was based on this, distorted interpretation of reality and ultimately led to a nightmare.
Right. It's important to understand that historical and cultural context to fully grasp the complexities of this really tragic chapter.
Absolutely. And despite the horrors of the Khmer Rouge regime, I think it's also important to acknowledge the resilience of the Cambodian people. They endured unimaginable suffering, but they never gave up hope. And in the years since the regime's fall, they've shown incredible strength and determination in rebuilding their lives and their country.
Their story is just this testament to the human spirit, to our capacity for hope and healing, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy.
Yeah, it's truly inspiring, I think, their strength and resilience. But I think it's also important to remember that there were individuals who actively resisted the regime, even during the darkest of times.
Absolutely. There were countless Cambodians who risked their lives to help others, to protect their families, to preserve their culture, to hold on to their humanity in the face of just unimaginable brutality. Teachers who secretly educated their students, artists who hid their work, monks who practiced their faith in hiding, ordinary people who shared their meager rations with those in need. These acts of resistance, however small, they were significant. They represented this refusal to be broken, a belief in the inherent dignity of human life.
Yeah. Their courage and compassion offer this inspiring reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, individuals can make a difference.
And it's also worth noting, I think, the efforts that have been made in the aftermath of the regime to reconcile with the past. It's a difficult process and it's ongoing. But how do you come to terms with such a horrific chapter in your nation's history? How do you rebuild trust, heal those wounds, and move forward?
Right. And the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, which was established in 2006, that's been, I think, a significant step. This tribunal has been tasked with trying senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge for crimes against humanity, genocide, other atrocities.
It's been a long and arduous process, but it's been crucial, I think, in providing some measure of justice for the victims and their families. It's also been essential in documenting the regime's crimes, establishing a historical record, and promoting accountability.
Right. And of course, no trial, no tribunal can ever fully address the scale of the suffering that was inflicted. But it's an important step, I think, towards healing and reconciliation.
It is, and it's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, justice, however imperfect, it is possible.
And I think, the Cambodian people, they've also shown remarkable forgiveness in the face of all they've endured.
It's a testament to their strength and their belief in the power of hope. They've chosen to embrace forgiveness, to rebuild their communities, and to create a better future for themselves and their children.
It's a powerful example of human resilience and the possibility of healing even after the most profound trauma. And what about their culture? I mean, despite everything they endured, it survived.
Yeah, the Khmer Rouge, they tried to eradicate Cambodian culture.
Yeah.
But they couldn't completely destroy it. Their art, their music, their dance, their traditions, they endured. Expressions of a spirit that the regime simply couldn't extinguish.
It's a reminder that even the most brutal regimes can't entirely erase a culture. The human spirit is too strong. Our need for expression is too deep.
It really is remarkable. Even in the midst of those horrors, they held on to that cultural identity. It says a lot about their strength, their resilience as a people.
It really is. And it's this powerful reminder that art and culture, they can provide solace and hope even in those darkest of times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we've been talking about the Khmer Rouge regime, it offers some really profound lessons for all of us. And one that really stands out to me is the importance of vigilance, when it comes to unchecked ideology.
Right. Easy to look back at history and judge,
Yeah.
right, to think that it could never happen again. But as we've seen, even well-intentioned ideologies, they can be twisted and manipulated to justify really terrible things.
Yeah. I mean, the Khmer Rouge, they genuinely believed they were creating a utopia. Their vision of this agrarian society free from class inequality, it was appealing on the surface, right? But in their pursuit of this vision, they completely disregarded basic human rights, the complexities of human nature.
They tried to like force their ideology onto reality.
Oh,
And the consequences were catastrophic.
they were.
And it's a sobering reminder, I think, that we must always be critical of our own beliefs, be willing to question authority,
Yeah.
and never let ideology, I think, override our humanity.
Absolutely. And, we also have to be mindful of the dangers of conformity and groupthink, right? I mean, the people who carried out the Khmer Rouge atrocities, they weren't all inherently evil. A lot of them were ordinary people who were swept up in this tide of fear and propaganda.
Yeah. It's a disturbing thought, isn't it? That under certain circumstances, any of us could be susceptible to those kinds of influences.
It is. And it underscores the importance of, cultivating critical thinking skills, questioning what we're told, and
Yeah.
and having the courage to speak out against injustice, even when it's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's easy to get lost in the horrors of this regime.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to end on a note of hope. Despite everything, Cambodia has survived. The culture endures, and the people have rebuilt their lives and their country.
Yeah, it's a testament to their remarkable resilience and strength. Cambodia's story, it's not just a tragic chapter in history, it's also a story of survival, of hope, and of the enduring power of the human spirit.
It really is. And so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Khmer Rouge, I hope our listeners out there will remember that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there is always hope, and that by understanding the past, we can work toward a future where such atrocities are never repeated.